Live.
We're live. Well, here I am. Well, I'm going to tell you where I am. I'm in my kitchen in Broomhill in Sheffield.
I'm in my workroom in Mulgai, just north of Glasgow.
And I am on the top floor of my parents' house, where I am marooned for the foreseeable future.
Because we are not playing to you live at the Crucible, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the music we would have played. One of the first very sad cancellations of the coronavirus crisis was a weekend where we would have played lots of works by Beethoven for winds. And so we want to have a little bit of a chat about these. So we would have played Beethoven's sextet and his octet, both of which are very early works. It's slightly confusing because they have very high opus numbers, because they were written before he'd gone to Vienna when he was still in Bonn. And they were later published to try and make as much money as possible after his death, and given ridiculously high opus numbers. So you might think that they're mature works of late Beethoven. They're not, but they are gorgeous, amazing, life-affirming works of the young Beethoven. I'm going to ask Amy about the wind sextet, scored for pairs of clarinets, bassoons, and horns. And I'm going to ask in particular about the second movement.
I was hoping you were going to ask about that. It is one of the great operatic arias for bassoon that had ever been written and has since ever been written. It is extraordinary writing, and it's really unusual for a bassoon to have a tune like that written in that way. You're the soloist for basically the entire movement. I think at one point the pair of clarinets get a look in or something, but mostly it's all about you, and it's so beautiful, and it's these extraordinarily long phrases, and it's writing that is so unusual and so special, and I get so excited whenever that's programmed, so I'm devastated that it was cancelled.
I think the occasion when the pairs of clarinets get a look in at your tune, we're merely quoting you, don't worry. Exactly. I would agree. It is an incredible melody. He really seems to me to have seen the lyrical possibilities of the bassoon. I would say, even in Adrian's hearing, much more so than the oboe and the flute, especially. Well, I think about that melody. I think about the extraordinary extended melody he writes in the piano and wind quintet. I know he writes one for oboe, but he really goes to town on the bassoon one. Mm-hmm. And then I think of some of the works of the writing in the symphonies. And I think one of my favorite things of all time is to play the Ninth Symphony, and when the tune finally starts, when the bassoon counter melody comes in.
That's amazing.
I mean,
yeah.
It kills me every time.
Well, also the slow movement as well, all those long lines. Very extraordinary.
He rarely uses us as a comedian, which I like. Quite often we're sort of portrayed as the clown, and we have to do a lot of and rather unflattering playing. But Beethoven, it's so often dolce, expressive, quite often sad tunes in a way that we get to play. And also they're much longer phrases than most people write bassoon tunes for, which is sometimes a little bit exhausting to try and actually get through them, especially the one in the piano and wind quintet. I'm forever A, attempting to do it in one breath, and B, when I fail at that, attempting to find a good place to breathe within the phrase. Of course, there isn't one. So it's sort of my nemesis, even though it's my favorite tune.
I think there are so many examples of that. I mean, I think it's probably largely to the fact that during Beethoven's life, the development of the wind instruments was happening so radically, especially at that time. And he was forever, I'm thinking especially in the symphonies, pushing the boundaries of the limitations of the instruments. I mean, I always think of the beginning of the Seventh Symphony. It's like a 40-second phrase, and on more than one occasion I've been caught out by a conductor coming on and launching in without any warning, and you've just like taken half a breath instead. You sort of got it by the end of it, mentioning no names. But I think the thing that certainly go on.
Well, I was going to say he uses the oboe very lyrically in the Seventh Symphony. It's not quite the kind of heartfelt writing that he always gives to the bassoon, but he uses it very dramatically. And I think more so than ever, why do you think he chooses to stop the first movement of the Fifth Symphony and give the oboe a cadenza?
Yeah, well, I think he gives all the wind instruments prominent parts in a way that possibly before that audiences were not used to. I mean, certainly if you think of all those critiques of the first performances of many of Beethoven's symphonies, they were often not really very good reviews, and it was usually the wind players that got the brunt of those. And I think that's just because, you know, that they couldn't play it, because what Beethoven was wanting emotionally, he was really pushing. And, you know, even to the point, as you mentioned earlier, Amy, about the stamina required. I mean, one of the hardest things I found about playing Beethoven symphonies is that they're really tiring. I mean, again, Beethoven 7 with all the repeats, that's knackering. Eroica, that's what, 45 minutes? Beethoven 9 is an hour. You know, so they're huge scale works, which probably before that, you know, players hadn't come across. I mean, I think Schubert 9 is probably the only other piece other than Beethoven 9 where I'm allowed to bumper. I mean, it's, you know.
A friend of mine, the old principal clarinet at the Halle, she said that playing the first clarinet part of Beethoven 9 ran childbirth a very close second in terms of pain. I mean, she must have been doing something wrong, I imagine, but while playing Beethoven 9. But it's funny how Beethoven's writing is, Schubert 9 is just exhausting, whereas Beethoven's, it's like absolutely, it's painful. It's like, it's exhausting and it's tiring and it's very uncomfortable to play.
It's also the emotional and dramatic level as well. He sort of literally ramps it up. It's not just the duration, it's also the intensity that you're playing with. And I think it's also the fact, you know, that he's really expanding the dynamic level. So often you're playing, you know, quite strongly. And I think if you think back to the instruments that these poor people would have been playing on back in those days, it's no wonder that, you know, they would have struggled.
I mean, I think also people talk about in the Ninth Symphony, and especially in the Missa Solemnis, like even the choral parts are just absolute killers. And I don't think he had any, whereas Mozart, of course, writes so it's the most comfortable, beautiful, handcrafted, gorgeous thing that fits so beautifully. None of that with Beethoven. He wants to push you to the edges. He wants
my friend, who's a very world famous soprano, said that Beethoven 9 is just like standing and screaming on stage. That is how it feels to perform it. And they all love it and they all want to do it, but she says it's just a killer, an absolute killer.
Quite often this solo singers are placed right behind us and like sounds like it sometimes.
I mean, I find that
also it's worth saying for anyone who doesn't know that bumper, as Adrian referred to earlier, is when we have someone sitting next to us playing our part when we're too exhausted to play it, which is a rare privilege.
Just give them a quick nudge in the ribs and they can take over. Yeah, but it's very rare to be given that.
Can I just say we never have bumpers in my orchestra?
Really? Oh well, you're a chamber orchestra.
Germany.
So, but Adrian, can I ask you a little bit about the chamber music that he writes for oboe? Because obviously you're in the octet, you're in the piano and wind quintet, but then he also writes some other works for oboe. Can you tell us about those?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm right in saying that all the wind pieces that he wrote were pre-Vienna. So I think the octet he took to, because he started learning with Haydn, didn't he? And he took the octet there to sort of impress him. But I think he'd actually started writing it before he moved.
He wrote it in Bonn. It was then later published as a string quintet.
Okay. What I was originally going to say was that one of the things that I find brilliant about the wind music that we were unfortunately having to cancel is that I find that compared to when we're sat in an orchestra, if you think about the layout of an orchestra, from where I'm sat, I have the clarinets and bassoons behind me, and I have the flute on my right. But you're pretty much basically not working as a wind team visually. You're sort of a section that's all facing the conductor and the strings. And so when it comes to working in a sort of chamber way, it's a very different way of working, and it's so lovely to have that sort of visual interaction on stage with the octet and the piano winds as well. And I think in that way, what's great is that Beethoven really understands all the instruments. I mean, in the same way that Mozart did as well. I mean, obviously the piano and winds, the Opus 16, has to be a homage to Mozart's K452. Even though I think it's right in saying that it wasn't published in Beethoven's life. But I think he knew the score. Well, he must have done. I mean, clearly.
Oh, Mozart wasn't published in Beethoven's life. Right.
Yeah. But anyway, slightly digressed. So the two trios that Beethoven wrote. So he wrote two trios for the unusual combination of two oboes and cor anglais, and that particular ensemble had a very short but very seminal Vogue period, and Beethoven composed these two pieces for a set of brothers, the Timer brothers, and I believe that their father was also an oboe player. So the sounds, I always thought the sounds going on in their house must have been pretty extraordinary at certain points. But anyway, so these three brothers toured round the whole of Central Europe, playing these two trios as well as all the others that had been written previously. So so the first one is I think Opus 87, which again is a absurdly late opus number, given that it was written in 1790 something, and that's a C major trio, which he also then, well, he published both of them for, as I said, two oboes and cor anglais, but he then also published them for a variety of mixed ensembles. So he wrote them out for string trio and then flute and violin and viola and oboe and violin and viola. So clearly wanted to make more money. But probably the more interesting one is he wrote a set of variations on Lacidarum. So again, that's another homage to Mozart. And I was going to be, well, I've played them a lot with violin and viola, which I think works incredibly well. But it has to be said, if you ever get the chance to listen to them in their original form, it's quite an extraordinary noise. I mean, of course, the cor anglais was an instrument that was used a lot back then. It sort of was a development of the oboe to caccia, which of course Bach used a lot in the oratorios and passions. But there is something about that sound that is quite extraordinary. But as I say, it was quite a short Vogue period, and it died out. But they're wonderful pieces, and great invention. I've always thought that in a way, theme and variations is one of the hardest compositional forms to really come off, and I think it really shows Beethoven's great ability, because he's able to do that. If you think of
he was the king of variation, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
still is. There's few people that I can bear their theme and variations of. In general, I just find it insufferable, and Beethoven's I just find absolutely ingenious every time in every format.
It's just the
And
invention is extraordinary.
throughout his life, I mean, it becomes more and more. So but I even rather love the variations of the trio for bassoon, flute and piano, which is super early and very simple. But those variations, you can you have to work a little bit more to hear the imagination of a teenager. But once you hear it kind of get inside that head, you think, oh my gosh, that's really something. And then, of course, he goes on to write, I mean, when you think of the late piano sonatas, the variations there, I mean, it's just like mind-blowing, and how these themes expand and just become more and more beautiful. He's really, and also the slow movement of the Ninth Symphony, of course, is an amazing set of double variations where he keeps switching between tunes and then variating that tune in turn. It's extraordinary what he does with it.
It's quite interesting that we, in a way, because often we sort of gently compare the chamber music, the wind chamber music of Beethoven and Mozart, because quite often they're performed in the same concert. And it's quite interesting that so Beethoven's is obviously a young composer's music, whereas the Mozart compositions are sort of, well, they're not fully mature, but they're they're getting that way. So I find that really interesting, especially with the piano and wind quintets, how he treats them.
I mean, remember, it's not too young, the piano and wind quintet, even though it's only Opus 16. He waited and waited until he produced his Opus 1. It was him that said, these are my Opus 1. And they're the first three trios for piano trio. And they are major, mature, extraordinary works.
I mean, you just think of the opening of the Opus 16. I mean, it couldn't be any other composer. It really couldn't. Even though there's this obvious connection with Mozart's work as well. But anyway, what I was saying earlier is about the fact that I find that the biggest shame about this cancellation of the bigger, especially the bigger stuff. I mean, whenever I see you guys play the septet, for instance, it just looks so fun. It's amazing. Obviously, it's amazing music, but the interaction in that sort of larger ensemble format. I always feel that whenever we do get to play wind octets or sextets or whatever, and it is quite rare, unfortunately, due to usually finance, but it's always such fun, and we get to invite our friends to double alongside us, and that's and I guess because largely I guess the music is sort of serenade. It's light-hearted music. I mean, even the Mozart serenades have their light-hearted modes.
I seem to remember you producing a beautiful thing about how, because all the harmony music, the wind octet and wind sextet, small wind ensemble stuff that Beethoven writes is all written in Bonn.
Yeah.
Where it was very much at vogue because it was performed in people's houses. I mean, huge houses. I mean, in their palaces, exactly, in their fancy pants houses. Because string music was considered rather harmful and wind music considered rather beneficial for digestion. And so it was performed at meals. You told me that story, and I love it.
Well, that's right. Well, there's the, of course, the octet in Don Giovanni.
Yes, of course.
At the meal,
yeah.
So
on stage.
On stage. So I mean,
yes.
And of course there are those accounts. There are many accounts written in letters about these performances in homes, and in a way, it's really Mozart that took that outdoor music and transferred it to a higher plane, if you like, with the Grand Partita and the two wind octets. But the Beethoven works are sort of lighter in style, maybe.
Maybe what we can do is write to the manufacturer of kind of Rennies or something, and get a wind octet version that is sort of very beneficial to them. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the septet. And we were just, before we pressed record again, noticing that almost everything written for the winds is in E flat major. That's not true of your oboe trio, though.
No, they're both in C major. Yeah.
C major.
But I think they're special cases because of the instrumentation. Because I think by and large the issue with the keys is down to the horns, which had to sort of change all their piping, and the early development of the clarinet, which sort of had a few years to catch up with the other wind instruments in terms of its development.
Yes, the clarinet doesn't play in actually for quite a long time. Doesn't play chromatically, because for a weird reason of physics, the laws of physics and how the clarinet makes it sound mean that whether if the oboe or bassoon or flute wants to go up the octave, they put the same fingers down and either overblow or press a key that takes them up the octave. With us, it takes us up a 12th, so it takes us up 4 more notes than the other instruments. And so if you imagine you have on most wind instruments, we then have to manage to get 12 notes in with just one set of fingers, which is why the clarinets didn't become chromatic, because it's like we've got to squish more notes in, and it took them time to work out how to do that. The more you know, Amy Harman.
I think I'm right in saying that also that just because of historically the clarinet was a later developer, there were many more versions of the clarinet that were sort of being manufactured around Europe at that time, and so there wasn't a standard as much as with the other instruments, and so composers probably felt less safe pushing the limits
because they wouldn't know what you'd turn up with.
Well, precisely, because they would hope for their sort of superstar musicians, but I guess with travel in those days, they couldn't guarantee that the right people would be in the right place necessarily.
Of course, everybody played everything. It wasn't that you said, I need this star clarinetist. You went and there was a star wind player and they all it was like going to London's West End, and where people play sax, doubling flute, doubling bass clarinet, doubling, they switch between all these instruments. And it was exactly the same back then, that there was this new instrument and said, oh, I'll have one of those, and had a go at it. It's not like now where we're very dull and stick to mastering one instrument.
You know what I discovered only a couple of years ago was that that Beethoven wrote an Oboe Concerto, but it was lost.
What?
Yep.
Oh no, that's heartbreaking.
It is heartbreaking. There's a fragment of the slow movement that survived, and it's been reconstructed, but obviously it's just guesswork.
Oh God, I want to hear it.
Yeah, but it's written. One of the early catalogues mentions it. I think Haydn mentions it, that Beethoven wrote it. I mean, again, early work. I mean, sort of, it would have been 1790 something. But
it's like all the lost Mozart bassoon concertos. There was like 5 of them. I know. We would have been like celebrities. But sadly,
Dvorak Clarinet Quintet, wasn't that lost?
Dvorak Clarinet Quintet. That's one of the recurring sadnesses.
Oh no, that actually really breaks my heart that wasn't a thing.
I can't cope with that news.
Okay, here's a little story. This is absolutely true. I once had a dream that I discovered a lost Schubert Oboe Quartet, and the only fragment that they'd found of it was a bar's rest. How sad's that?
Of all the dreams that you wake up and remember.
Absolutely true.
That dream.
I was devastated.
I love it.
Absolutely true.
That's
anyway.
Absolutely fantastic.
Sorry,
I think what we're basically trying to say, we're kind of jolly jealous of string players having all that repertoire to play, and all the string quartets, all the piano trios, all the violin sonatas, all the cello sonatas. But never mind. We have more fun in orchestra, I think.
I was about to say, but then when you're a tutty string player in an orchestra, think of how much you want to be a wind player.
Exactly. Yeah, no, I agree. I was trying to think more about the wind writing in the symphonies, because I think there's a lot of kind of glorious wind writing in the early works and in the septet, in the piano wind, in the clarinet trio with cello. But it really is the symphonies where we become actually kind of big stars in a way.
Yeah. And that's why there are so many orchestral excerpts in the book from Beethoven. You know, just the way that he really pushes the instruments. I mean,
and I think about how he kind of, with the clarinet, there's a natural following on from the way that Mozart, who was the first person who really wrote amazingly for the clarinet. Haydn did a little bit. There are some amazing Haydn clarinet parts, for instance, in the Creation, which he wrote before he came to London with all his symphonies. The first London symphony has a very grown-up, beautiful clarinet part. Then he brought that from Vienna to London, and then the rest of them he wrote in London. And they all have kind of baby clarinet parts that are really not worth playing. And my only explanation is that the clarinetist in London must have been so terrible that he was like, but Beethoven kind of pushes the clarinet as an instrument, and it's an absolute staple in his orchestra. And then writes some actually extraordinary stuff for us. The first couple of symphonies, even by the fourth symphony, we're still a little bit going in an Alberti bass, but he also writes some just like out of space lines for us. In the fourth symphony, the slow movement.
Oh my God, the slow movement, I mean, the clarinet tune.
It's incredible. It's really incredible. It's like he knew how to dream of more beauty than anybody else. Mozart, of course, dreamt, but did it very perfectly. Did it so it kind of sounded the most gorgeous, but he didn't push as far as Beethoven. Beethoven was a revolutionary, of course.
It's always a bit dissatisfied as well, Beethoven. It's always like he's trying to get somewhere and he's pushing and pushing and pushing, but you never feel like it's resolved. I don't know, I feel that with the bassoon parts, that they're never quite the finished perfect product. They're so searching, which is what makes them so amazing to play. And also when I play them, I feel I never find anywhere where I can take a bloody bar off, and I'm playing the whole time
anywhere.
But everything is so important. I feel like everything he wrote, he meant so much that you just can't, if you miss it out, it feels like sacrilege. You know, it's awful.
And also where to breathe in those phrases. I mean, it's like
he just doesn't care, but which I love. No. He's like, I don't care. Don't breathe, you don't deserve it.
Suffer.
It's that sort of feeling that the music is more important than the instrument, you know, the way that the instrument might or might not work. I mean, it's similar for us at the end of Eroica. We have that amazing chorale, and it's just the lines are just endless, and of course it's right at the end of the symphony, so you're exhausted, but no matter, you know, the music is at its most gorgeous there, so there's nothing you can do about it. And a nice bassoon part in the last movement of the fourth symphony, Amy.
I mean, hell on a plate. That is, so it's, by the time you get to that, it's right at the end of the symphony. So you spend, and actually it's such a shame because I love that symphony, but I spend the whole piece feeling utterly miserable because I know I've got to play 2 bars on my own of the fastest notes in the world with a bloody grace note shoved in halfway through just to trip you up. Because when you're going digga 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 digga, if someone makes you go digga 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 digga, it's like being slapped round the face. You just can't do it. So
I think maybe we should like this last movement goes yabba dibby dibby digga 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 digga. Well, it quite often goes faster than that. Yabba dibby dibby digga 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 digga. And the strings are all going yabba digga digga digga, and they're just moving their bow to and forward. It's very easy for them. And then that stops, and the bassoon. Suddenly,
it's so awful. But also before that, it's like the sort of screws are being turned because it's harmonically going up and up and up and up and up, and then it drops out and you're on your own, and it's so it's just so mean.
It makes me think of that bit also in the last movement of the Eroica as well, where the oboes double the violins, and then the clarinets get it afterwards, and they're all legato, and it just makes me laugh. It's like, really, come on, have a go.
No, they should be doing it double time. I do it with double tonguing normally. Cheaters, honestly.
I once got asked to flutter tongue it.
Oh, I love that flutter tonguing.
Oh, it was quite fun. No, I've been asked to stand up with that. Yeah, no, it's an amazing moment. Our Turkish moment.
Yeah.
Oh, that's amazing. Brilliant. Well, I think
we haven't even mentioned Pastoral Symphony. all that bird action.
I keep thinking about Pastoral.
Yeah,
Pastoral actually, Matt, reminds me of the septet, because the septet is, the way he writes for clarinet and bassoon is just tunes in octaves in the septet, which is such a beautiful way to play together. And Pastoral has the most gorgeous clarinet and bassoon tunes together in octaves. Slow movement. I mean, it's amazing.
Is true.
And I always think of us as like partners in crime in Beethoven.
Yeah, totally. Although for me, the Sixth Symphony is like the most awkward and the least kind of, it's kind of, you're very prominent. The clarinet is enormously prominent, but it's a very thankless task. I actually, at the end, when Adrian said about excerpts, what he means is that you get these books of like little orchestral excerpts and you're required to play them at orchestral auditions. So they become these famous solos that kind of strike terror through the heart of any young aspiring orchestral player. And one of the ones for us that kind of probably becomes more difficult, because it is one of these things that you've been told is very difficult and you'll have to play in these auditions, is the end of the first movement of the Sixth Symphony. And we have to do these kind of roulades of and you're supposed to kind of do them light and do this beautiful diminuendo while you're running out of air. And it's terribly hard work. That's the one thing that is absolutely guaranteed to raise my pulse significantly through just terror. One day we'll play it together.
You've done quite a lot of tours of like cycles, you know, all the same.
Yeah, I should be doing one now. I should be in Frankfurt playing one today. Yeah.
I mean, that must be exhausting.
Actually, I probably should be playing the Sixth Symphony tonight. I think about it. It was at first, and now I know all the symphonies so very well. We started off, the first ever cycle we did in Yokohama in near Tokyo in Japan, in this beautiful Minato Mirai Hall. And we did it that we played 1, 2, 3 on Friday night. We then played 4, the violin concerto, and number 5 at lunchtime, I think, on the Saturday. We then played 6 and 7 on Saturday evening, and then lunchtime, actually 12 o'clock on the Sunday, we played 8, and then the 9th Symphony. And,
I need to lie down even just hearing that. That is a shocker.
Well, it was glorious because opposite the hall is a fun fair with an enormous roller coaster.
I love that. And you can see it out the dressing room windows.
We finished having kind of this, and it was all televised and high stress. And we finished, and we just all sort of threw our tails off, jumped into t-shirts and jeans, and ran across to the fun fair, and jumped on the roller coaster. And we just all kind of went around this thing, arms in the air, screaming, letting off lots of pressure. It was an amazing moment.
It reminds me of my favourite tour, one of my favourite tour stories involving green rooms. One of the best green rooms ever is in the hall in San Sebastián, on the north coast of Spain. And I remember just before the concert, I think it must have been a lunchtime concert, and we decided, we changed into our tails, and we decided to go out to the beach, and took our concert shoes off, put our socks inside our shoes, and paddled in the water, only to turn round to find a local dog peeing in all our concert shoes. and we then had to, so we all had to go onto stage, and so we all had to go. We had like about 20 minutes to get on stage, and so we just did the concert in our socks.
I couldn't work out if you were going to do it in wee-soaked shoes or in your socks.
It's a good way to start a concert, though. Put us in the right frame.
Well, in which case, we probably outstayed our welcome in your front rooms or garden sheds or wherever it is you might be watching this. But we're very sorry that we're not playing for you tonight or yesterday or whenever we were supposed to be playing. And look forward to the day when we can all go and play a concert and share music together in a hall.
Until then, take care. Stay safe.